So I'm Sandra Matz. I'm an assistant professor of management at Columbia Business School, and I'm mostly working at the intersection of psychology, computer science, and business. Yeah, so I think it's interesting because it's really kind of getting at the roots of psychology as a behavioral science. So we're looking at all kinds of digital footprints. That could be someone's, like what they post on Facebook, what they like, what they talk about on Twitter, but it could also be slightly more subtle cues of behavior, such as transaction records. So what we buy with our credit card, for example, or smartphone sensor data. So GPS data, for example, where is it that people go? What is it that people do? Who do they call? So all these kind of subtle traces of human behavior that we can now collect in the online world. So I guess most of the data that I'm using comes from companies. So I usually collaborate with startups, companies to get some of their user data. So for example, one of the projects that I'm currently working with is in collaboration with this startup in Germany where we're tracking users' GPS data, and we're also asking them questions about their mood, about how they feel, kind of looking at depressive symptoms. So a lot of the data that we're working with is really coming from the real world and getting it from companies. I think it's like whenever I give talks, it's like one of the funny reactions that you get is like everybody saying like, oh, I'm not using Facebook for that purpose because I know that companies are using it to make inferences about me as a person, about the behavior, about my habits. And I think the point is really, it's not just Facebook, like all the traces that we leave on like using our smartphones, for example, or transaction records. I think those are all cues that people are not really aware of. And people don't really think about when they, for example, download a calendar app on their phone, that this app is also asking them to tap into their microphone, get access to all of the pictures, and also collect their GPS location. So I think most of the time people don't really get how much information they're giving up. I think that's the problem that we have right now, is that it's like a binary choice almost. You can either use the services like Facebook or the apps that you download from the Google Play Store or the App Store. And it's either you use it and you accept the terms of services, or you don't use them at all. And I think that's something that has to change, where basically users can opt into different types of data collection. And there might be an option where you can say, okay, you don't want to give up all of your data, you don't want to share all of your personal data with the company. Maybe it's like a paid service. And I think like the question is how many people are going to use that, and I'm not super optimistic about that because people often say they care about privacy, and then if it comes to kind of investing a few dollars a month, they probably are not going to do it, but at least it should be an option. So there's actually a lot of research out there by now looking at like the relationships between people's digital footprints and their personality traits. So I'm certainly not the first one to do that. So we know from, I guess, as early as 2013 that we can predict, for example, people's personality from their Facebook likes, from Twitter. Some of the work that I've been recently involved in is kind of predicting personality from transaction data. So really looking at what people spend on a day-to-day basis. And we know, and this is really something that actually was surprising in the beginning, is that pretty much anything we use, so all of the sources that we can possibly imagine, are to some extent predictive of our psychological traits, whether that's personality, values, intelligence, all the socio-demographic variables. And then the question becomes like, what do you do with them? So we know that we can accurately infer people's personality just by looking at what they do online, and what are the use cases. So one of the areas that I've been most interested in is kind of personalized advertising or targeted advertising based on personality. So some of the things that we've done in that context is just saying, okay, the same way that now advertisers target people based on specific behaviors or stuff that they've done in the past, can we target people, for example, based on their extroversion level? And then can we also influence their behavior by, for example, choosing specific products that are in line with their personality profile, or just by simply adapting the way that we communicate with people. So changing the message and making it more appealing to specific traits. we were kind of optimistic because there's quite a bit of lab research showing that if you change the message, for example, and you tailor it to people's personality traits, that seems to influence the way that people at least report they would behave when responding to some of that advertising. And what we see is that this also replicates if you actually do it on Facebook, for example. So we targeted extroverts using specific Facebook likes, specific interests within the Facebook advertising platform. And what we see is that people actually kind of click more often, they purchase more often if the messages that we use to advertise a specific product, for example, a beauty retailer, which was one of the products that we used, that people actually click more often and purchase more often. So I think that's one of the use cases where we can actually, to some extent, use this personality matching for good. So obviously you have this entire side where people are like, oh, you're manipulating us by suggesting things that are in line with our personality, or by changing messages in a specific way to make them more persuasive. I think there's a lot of benefit to doing that to some extent. So you can imagine there's like tons of stuff out there, like the number of products is almost unlimited. So there's no way that you can get through all of this stuff without at least some kind of filtering. And the idea of doing that based on personalities that we know from some of my earlier work is that if people spend money in a way that's aligned with their personality, that actually makes people happier. So you can imagine if we get an extrovert to spend more money on like social stuff, so going to bars, taking out friends, that actually makes them happier because they get to live their extroverted side or express their extroverted side. So I think that's one of the cases where actually targeting people based on their personality and recommending things to them that are in line with their personality is not just good for business, but also kind of helps the consumer make better decisions. I think it's a great question. I don't think we have a good answer to that yet. I think my point of view is that the most important thing is transparency. So if I at least understand what's happening, then maybe I'm willing to accept that. So if that's, you can imagine exercising, for example, or saving. So there's like all these behaviors that we're notoriously bad at kind of doing. So everything that gives us a reward in the future and that's painful right now, like savings being one example, is really difficult and something that most people struggle with. So my personal opinion, and again, I think that should be a discussion that we're having as a society, is if it's something that benefits individuals in the long term, a little bit of this paternalism, you could call it, is actually useful. Because we have a world that's full of temptations. We've created like almost an unlimited number of things that are out there and that are really tempting. And we're not doing a really good job at helping people navigate that environment and that landscape. So I think if really there's a clear benefit to the individual, then I wouldn't necessarily consider it manipulation. So I think we're not necessarily getting into that too much, because like what we're trying to do is really kind of see what can we learn about people's psychological motivations by studying their preferences, and then whatever we do in terms of influencing the behavior has like a very specific purpose. So if we learn that someone is extroverted, for example, then like the question is really, what do we do with it? And if we use it, for example, to help them save more money instead of convincing them not to vote on election day, then I think the purpose or the context that we're using it is kind of much more defining of whether something is ethical or not than just the pure technology itself. I think it's pretty much almost unlimited in terms of the inferences that we can make. So everything that, like all of our traits, like everything that we know about us as like people, is expressed in behavior to some extent. So it's very unlikely that there's something that we really absolutely cannot predict. I think what's going to be really interesting is like more the subjective experiences of people, which is still something like even if you express yourself in a specific way, the subjective experience that goes with it is something that might still be kind of difficult to capture, and that might vary quite a lot between individuals. So my experience going to a bar might be totally different to your experience going to the bar. And I think that's something that we're not necessarily great at capturing just now. I think to some extent it's very deterministic, because it's basically saying this specific behavior is related to this specific trait or this specific psychological state. So I think we'll have to be very careful in terms of how we use it. The way that I see it is just like another data point. So I would never, like in the context of hiring, for example, get rid of self-reports altogether, because that is like the opportunity for a candidate, for example, to express themselves and to be heard by the employer, and also kind of communicate something about how they see themselves. But like the way that I see it is much more as like an additional data point where we can see, okay, like this is how a candidate, for example, describes themselves. But then also there's like another data point that says that this is how they actually behave. And based on their behavior, whether that's again like their phone data, Facebook, whatever it is, it seems that they're probably much more extroverted than they admit in an interview, or like vice versa. So the way that I hope like this is kind of turning out in the future is really just another data point, and it's not the only data point that we're using. I think it very much depends. So I would always argue that you might want to keep it and then just use it as a starting point for a discussion. So if you see that there's a huge discrepancy between how someone portrays themselves in an interview and like what their data says about them, then I think that should be like a starting point for a discussion, and not necessarily a disqualifying argument where you say, okay, this person is clearly lying in the interview. And that really also goes back to the fact that like our predictions are nowhere perfect. So they are to some extent accurate on like an aggregate average level, but if you zoom into the individual, there's still so much room for error. So I would never say that just by looking at someone's data, that should become the crown truth, and we're just completely discarding people's subjective experience of themselves, or like the way that they self-describe. Yeah, so the way that we've done it so far, and I guess to some extent it actually is a very conservative estimate of how powerful it is. So we're not making any predictions about the individual, so we're not looking at your Facebook profile to make a prediction to say that you're extroverted. What we're doing is that we're just relying on data of other people. So we're saying, okay, based on like what we know from other people, we know that, for example, liking entourage on Facebook is a sign that you're extroverted. And then we can scale that for everybody else who's interested in entourage, even if we've never had access to your personal data. So I think this is really the danger of it to some extent, and also the beauty of it. Like if you think about it in terms of positive use cases, is that we can extrapolate from one group of people in terms of the relationships between footprints and psychological profiles to an entire new group of people without actually having access to their profiles themselves. I think it's incredibly difficult to regulate. I think it still needs that because it sends a signal and it kind of shows like people that governments care and that there's at least some kind of push for regulation. I think it's very difficult because oftentimes it's hidden. So Facebook might be using 1,000 dimensions right now. It's very likely that one of them at least measures extroversion to some extent. And if you don't label it as such, and if you're not actively kind of predicting extroversion, for example, it's very likely that in some way or another there's psychological information hidden in these profiles. So like what you say is like to some extent having, like we don't need access to your actual profile, but also like if we're using some of the existing techniques that are more behavioral in nature, still very likely that we're picking up on similar signal. So I think in that case it's much more the purpose that we're using it for rather than just making the predictions. So if we say, okay, we're using like whatever your data is to kind of convince you that you shouldn't go out on election day and vote in a democratic process, then that's a problem. But that could be like true for psychological targeting, that could be true for behavioral targeting. So I think one of the things that I'm most optimistic about is really this idea of privacy by design. So how can we design like applications, regulations, or even just products that kind of help people make privacy the default? Because if we don't have that, I'm not optimistic enough that people will actually care enough about. So even if we say, okay, people have to are allowed to opt out of some of the data services, I don't think that people will actually do it. So one of the things I think is really just kind of trying to make privacy the default, and then saying, okay, like maybe people are willing to share their information like voluntarily if the company manages to provide like an amazing service based on that data. And I think if there's like a few companies, like prominent companies starting to do that, I think others will have to follow. Because then if you can, then it becomes part of companies' value proposition. So it's the idea of like, okay, like instead of doing stuff behind your back and exploiting you, what we're offering is to kind of give you the option to share your data voluntarily, and we're going to offer an amazing service that makes it worth it. I think that's true, but I think if you make it transparent and you say, okay, look, this is all the data that we need, like we know that it's very intimate, trust us, we're going to handle it with like carefully and we're going to secure it, we do whatever we can to protect it, but we needed to kind of be able to offer you the service X and to make the service better than everything else that you've seen before. And I think if people have the choice to do that, and it's like a deliberate, like almost like an informed consent where people are like, okay, I understand that this is very intimate, but I also understand the benefit, I think then it's like a win-win where both sides can actually win in that thing. I think the problem is that most people are just not willing to pay a subscription fee instead of using it for free and then having their data being used to some extent. So I think that's what like people often say, like, oh, like I care about my data, it's so terrible that Facebook is using it for targeting. But then we're also all super happy to use Facebook for free, and most people wouldn't be willing to pay as little as like $3 a month to use Facebook like anonymously and not having their data being shared. So I think it's really not necessarily sharing data with third parties, but I think where companies can like really benefit is if they can use the data such that people really want to use their service and not other services. So I think that's the business model that people or that companies should actually aim for. I mean, so personality, I think, is the variable that's been studied most frequently, but we know all kind of different socio-demographic variables. So that's like age, gender, political orientation, sexual orientation, which is like one of the really intimate traits that people, I think, are often shocked by when you tell them that this is something we can infer from their Facebook profiles. But it also, like, if you stay in the psychological context, we can predict people's values. So what is it that they care about? We can predict something like materialism, like self-control, impulsivity. So really kind of pretty much anything that you can imagine is important in the context of individual differences is like predictable from people's psychological traits. I think that's true. So I feel like the way that it's portrayed in the media, it's a new wonder weapon, it's totally different to everything that we've seen before, or it's like totally useless and it doesn't work. And I think the truth is really somewhere in between. So if we've been using data for like a long time, it's certainly not coming up now, and we've always tried to tailor the messages that companies are using to some extent to the audience. So I think what's really new is that we can do it on the psychological level, and that means that people suddenly understand how intimate it is. So I don't think it's a huge jump in terms of whether we can predict behavior more or less accurately, but I think it's really this idea that people suddenly realize, oh, it's not just all of my Facebook likes that companies are now using, but they can actually infer that I'm extroverted, and that seems much, much more intimate than, say, Facebook using 1,000 behavioral dimensions to make predictions. And I think that the one aspect that is kind of new to some extent is that we can just change communication. So everything before was mostly focused on predicting future behavior, so saying like, what is someone going to purchase, which song is someone going to listen to. And now that we kind of have psychology around it, we can actually start crafting different messages. So we can say, okay, we talk to an extrovert in a different way than we talk to an introvert. And that was really difficult to do with like all these behavioral dimensions, but it's certainly something that if you think of like demographic targeting or kind of a beauty retailer crafting their message such that it appeals to like a woman of a specific age. It's been around for a while, it's just that we haven't really been able to do it on a very psychological level. I think there should be some kind of autonomy, and I think that's what I was saying about transparency. So I think only if you make it transparent, people actually realize how much of it is like an echo chamber that's kind of coming from this predictive world. Because that's a problem that we have right now, is people don't even realize that their news feeds are being personalized. Even though it's like, if you're kind of working on the tech side, it's extremely obvious. And there's also like, even if you notice, there's no way that you can change it. So there's no way that you can tell Facebook right now, stop showing me all this stuff that's exactly in line with what I believe in. So I think in that sense, like right now, the first step is transparency, and then the second step is like making it like an interactive environment where people can say, okay, like you're making all these predictions about me and you're using it to influence my behavior, but like stop it, or at least kind of give me the opportunity to see something else, something that you wouldn't show me if you were just optimizing for views and clicks. I think it's like obviously like an empirical question. I think from everything that we've seen so far, like people always say that they care a lot about privacy, but then at the end of the day, nobody even changes their privacy settings. And it's very kind of convenient and easy to stay within like a context that is confirming your values. So we see that even in the offline world where people tend to gravitate towards people who have similar attitudes. And you can, like if you think just for yourself, like it's very difficult if you're like, for example, very liberal and you talk to a hardcore Republican, it's not the easiest conversation that you can have. So I think oftentimes people avoid it because it's like not the easy route. So to some extent, like giving people autonomy might not necessarily lead to the outcomes that you want, where people are exposed to different views, which again might require a little bit more of the liberal paternalism side. I think that's the like baseline comparison that people usually don't make. Is like, okay, obviously there's an echo chamber online, but like there's also an echo chamber offline that people don't usually realize is happening, because I think it's like this idea that you have more control over it. So you have more control over the people that you surround yourselves with, rather than like what is being shown to you on your newsfeed. Is that always better and more diverse? Probably not. I think to some extent it's a false dichotomy. So people say like, oh, it's either prediction or it's understanding. And it's true that big data is coming at questions more from like the predictive nature, or just like an exploratory way of thinking. So we can just look at data and see like what are the patterns that we find. But then nobody prevents you from following up with a lab study, for example, to kind of really understand like what are the mechanisms behind it. So I think oftentimes big data is like falsely accused of not kind of lending itself to the question of like what are mechanisms, how does it contribute to theory. I think it's just a question of combining different methodologies. So kind of taking the benefits, taking everything that's good about big data, and then combining it with our traditional experimental methods that give us a little bit more room for experimenting on like mechanisms, trying to see why do we see the patterns that we see. The problem that where this is coming from is that most of the time prediction has been done in the context of computer science, and what they care about is mostly accuracy. So they don't really care about like why can we predict personality from Facebook likes, what are the specific things that are driving accuracy, but nobody stops you from them taking the next step. So even if we're working with models that are difficult to interpret, so let's say we're using a neural net where people say like this is just a black box, we don't really understand what's happening inside the model, nobody stops you from looking at the output. So if we, for example, take the predicting personality from faces, like what's happening in the model might be really difficult to understand, but you can still look at the output. So you can still look at, okay, like what do the faces, the 10 most extroverted faces look like? And then you can start spotting like differences in people's like physical appearance. So I think it's really the fact that like for now, most researchers stop at the point where they can accurately predict something without looking at the outcome and then seeing, okay, seems what's driving the effect. I think, well, that might be true. So to some extent, if we're just thinking about prediction, you might not be able to explain everything. But it's usually like what social science has been criticized like on the other end is that, well, we can explain stuff in like a tiny microcosmos, but we can't predict anything. So it's really, I think, like finding the right balance where we say, okay, like we have a certain understanding of what's happening in our models, but then also like if it's really about prediction and if it's about like influencing people's behavior, for example, helping them make the right decisions, then everything that we can do in terms of like predictive power is actually really useful. So you can think about it in the context of, for example, detecting depression. It's great to understand why people are depressed and like what are the specific symptoms, how do they interact. But if it's really about helping people figure out when they're entering a depressive episode and giving them the help that they need right at the point before they're actually going into a full depression, then anything that we can do in terms of predictive accuracy is golden. Not really. I wish I had that. The way that I think about it is really in terms of like the purpose. So I don't think about it in terms of this is a persuasive strategy that's ethical and that's one that's unethical. So I think any type of persuasive strategy, whether that's psychological profiling or whether that's nudging, really depends on like what you're trying to achieve. And I think that's the discussion that I would like to see on a societal level, on like a regulatory level, rather than really looking at like sharp distinctions between this technology is okay, this technology isn't, or this persuasive way of doing things is okay and this way isn't. I think it's really tricky because, as I said, like we're usually not very good at giving up stuff in the short term if it's painful. And some of it is true. Like if we kind of give away data and it makes our lives easier because we can use Facebook for free, it's very difficult to say that I don't want to do this. And the way that I like to think about it, and it's really just like a personal take on it, is like whenever I download an app, for example, like I'm asking myself, is this something that I would want for example, like people in my family. So when you kind of make decisions about other people, usually you take into account like a longer perspective more than a short-term perspective. So that's one way of just kind of trying to overcome the limitations that we have in like this feels great in the moment, but it's not really good in the long term. And then the second question of like, should we kind of give more should we actually be happy to give up autonomy to some extent because the computer might make better decisions? I guess that also kind of really depends on the context. So we know, for example, that people are happy for predictive technologies to be used in the context of healthcare. So I think it's really kind of whenever people see that there's a clear benefit, and when you don't have the suspicion that the company doing it is just kind of trying to exploit you for profits. And I think that's when people are willing to kind of say, okay, I know my own limitations. I'm willing to kind of give a little bit more decision power through an algorithm, for example. But for that, I think a lot needs to change in terms of like convincing people that algorithms can be trusted, that companies can be trusted to use their data responsibly. So I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we're there at the point where people are happy to kind of concede decision power to algorithms and companies.